I've seen your videos explaining the fall of man, where you mentioned that God gave authority to man to rule the world. I've come across some clips where you mentioned that dominion was given to Jesus rather than to man. Please, sir, was man given the authority to be the ruler of the world, or dominion was meant for Jesus from the beginning of the book of Genesis?
Well, again, the reason why many people get confused about the book of Genesis is they've not taken time to look at that book very seriously. If you observe, the book of Genesis actually is a book of beginnings, and Moses was the writer of Genesis. So Moses introduced, now remember, Moses was not there when Genesis happened, because Moses was born in Exodus chapter 2 verse 2, which means it was the after event reportage. So what Moses gave us is after event reportage. So which means he's not going to write it the way it happened sequentially. He's going to write it the way he understood from both the visions he had and the oral communication, because the Old Testament people had a tradition in Genesis where from generation to generation they told stories of the previous generation. So that's what we call the oral tradition. And of course Moses had a vision, so some of Genesis was from vision, the other ones were from oral tradition. Now, so because it was after the event reportage, he opened the book by introducing the theme of the Bible, which is salvation, the plan of God. He began to introduce God's intent, God's plan, God's purpose in Genesis chapter 1. That's all he was busy doing in Genesis chapter 1. He was not giving an account of how the world evolved or an account of creation. Moses was not a scientist. He was using the story of creation as a parable to communicate God's plan, God's purpose for man. That's what Moses did in Genesis. That's why even the creation story is not complete. The creation story is not detailed. He just gave you snippets here and there. But the message of it, because it's a parable, and in a parable you have a fact, you have fiction, and you have lessons. You don't stay with the fact and fictions. You look for the lesson. So the lesson is what Moses used the parable to communicate, which is God's plan, God's intent for man. So when it comes to Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, where God says, let us make man in our image. You know, if you understand the Bible very well, the New Testament interprets the Old Testament. The New Testament demystifies the Old Testament. The Old Testament is mystery. The New Testament is revelation, what we call apocalypsis. Apocalypsis means the unveiling, to unravel. Mystery is the word mysterion in the Greek. It means that which requires explanation, which means that the Old Testament must be explained. You can't just read the Old Testament hook, line, and sinker. It has to be explained. The entire Old Testament has to be explained, because the Old Testament is Jesus concealed. The Old Testament is types, shadows, prophecies, promises. All right. The Old Testament is what we call a skia. You will see things in obscurity. You won't have details. You won't see things in their details. So which means that the Old Testament therefore must be explained. The explanation of the Old Testament is the New Testament, because in Romans 16:25, Paul spoke about the revelation of the mystery which was kept secret since the world began, but now is made manifest to his saints, to whom God will make known what is the mystery, what is the secret of this mystery, all right, which is revealed to the saints. So you have the revelation and you have the mystery. So the Old Testament is interpreted by the New Testament. So when you read Genesis and God says, let us make man in our image, the first thing you want to find out from the New Testament is, who is the image of God? If you read the entire New Testament, Adam was not the image of God. In the entire New Testament, only Jesus is the image of God. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3, Jesus is the express image of God. Colossians chapter 1 verse 15, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. 1 Timothy 3:16, without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness, that God is manifest in the flesh. So Jesus is God manifest in the flesh, which means Jesus is the express image, the perfect imprint of God. Jesus is the full reflection of God in humanity. So when God says, let us make man in our image, remember Genesis 1 is God's intent, which means the intention of God is that out of the Godhead, a man will come forth. So Jesus is the man who came out of the Godhead. God became a man. John chapter 1 verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Verse 14, same context. And the Word became flesh. God became a man. The Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. God became a man. Jesus is God who became a man as the image of God in humanity. So when God was saying, let's make man in our image, what God was saying is, out of the Godhead, we're going to produce a man out of the Godhead. Now, if God is almighty, he should be whatever he wants to be at any point in time. So out of the Godhead, a man came. That man is the image of God. Now, today, you only become the image of God when you receive Christ. Outside Christ, you're not the image of God. Outside Christ, you are the image of your parents. You only become the image of God in Christ. So that's what we call the new creation. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Now therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creation. So you're not a new creation until you are found in Christ, which means the family of God, which is God's plan from Genesis chapter 1, will be adopted in Christ Jesus. You cannot be a child of God outside Christ. You become a member of God's family in Christ Jesus. So the image of God in Genesis is Christ Jesus.